Yeah, that's a good question. You can't necessarily tell by the grain or the color of the sand, but there's generally a uniformity. There was a uniformity at this site, and it was almost it was like working at a site where you have a Mount St. Helens tephra, and then you have life coming back, and then the mountain erupts again, and you have kind of this layer cake look to it. There's a very interesting deposit down here just above on the north side of Bob Creek that I've always suspicioned might be tsunami sand, but haven't had that confirmed yet. So
I think of the reference that I read this in about the earthquake 600 years ago.
300 years ago.
Well, 300 years ago. But that it appeared that they were occurring on about a rather even 600-year basis, these large quakes. Is that what your understanding is?
I mean, the kind of information I'm getting from geologists is, they say start worrying at 300 years. So I thought, well, maybe the turn of the century, that was 300 years. It wasn't going to be just white 2K or the computer problem that we might have. But it's not, nothing is that regular. They're doing sensing all the time throughout the areas. So, people are on top of it and looking for them. But, there's no, I don't think it's not an exact science like the eruption of mountains. You know it's coming, but you don't know exactly what day it's going to be in your backyard. So it's taking us home. Does that look familiar? On a sunny day. One thing that I have been dealing with when I look at archaeological sites on the Oregon coast is the erosion, the problem we're losing our sites. But we have been losing our sites since the end of the Ice Age. I talked a little bit about Taconich Landing, where the sites have been dated back to about 8,000 years ago. That, for many, that was a breakthrough in archaeology of the Oregon coast when that was excavated in the mid-1980s. All of the data coming from archaeological sites on the Oregon coast at that point had kind of maxed out at about 3,000 years ago. And while we know, if we talk to tribal elders, they will tell us that they have been here from time immemorial. Well, 3,000 years is, that's not necessarily time immemorial. So being a scientist where you can look only at your data and report on that, if you don't have the data, you don't make the stuff up. So finding an 8,000-year-old date was pretty remarkable. And what preserved that site at Taconich Lake from the encroaching water level, which I really haven't talked anything about yet, was that there's a small, I shouldn't say small, it's kind of a shallow sandstone cliff that has protected that site that's on the west side of that lake. And that served as kind of a buffer, and that preserved it. Here on the Oregon coast, as a result of the earthquakes, we get differential movement of the earth. On the south coast, in this area, we tend to downwarp if there's an earthquake. The land tends to subside, or in kind of a rolling way. But on the south coast, the land is actually being pushed up as that San Juan Fuca plate rides down underneath the North American plate, and it pushes the North American plate up. And that has preserved sites. And as Roberta Hall, professor at Oregon State University, emeritus now, started looking at those places, looking on the Oregon coast to see where she could find these ancient terraces, where she could find this particular type of geology that would hold the key to where maybe ancient sites have been. And on the south coast, those have been preserved. And so we're getting 10,000-year-old sites on the south coast. I keep looking for them here, haven't found any, but I'm not going to give up. But what's happening is that not only do you have the downwarping of this area, but you also have the rise in sea level. And an interesting study that was done on the Alsea estuary up at Walport suggested that as recently as 8,000 years ago, the sea level was about 180 feet lower than what it currently is today. you wouldn't have had oceanfront property 8,000 years ago. And what is even more astounding is that they estimate that the actual, now that's a graduated sandy plain in that area as opposed to a basalt outcrop as we have right here. But if the sea level is 180 feet lower, your ocean is going to be 4 miles further out. Well, most of us, when we go to the grocery store, where do we park? We park where we're close to carrying our groceries out. So my thinking is that we have a lot of sites that are now inundated off the Oregon coast that we may never be able to do any kind of data recovery because of the nature of the types of sites. So it doesn't faze me in the least to think that people have been here for a very, very long time and we just don't have the evidence to prove it. Some of you may have seen the recent Sea Grant films that they've been doing on climate change. And one of the professors that was interviewed on that suggests that the sea level right now, not talking about the melting of the, well, we are talking about the melting of the ice caps, but you know, rapid sea level rise at different periods depending on how much ice cubes were tied up on the continent at the time. And with the warming of the air, it was melting, and where does it go? It goes to the lowest level, which is the ocean. So now we have smaller ice fields, and we all hear the stories about how those are melting in front of us. But they're estimating now that in the next 100 years there will be a meter sea level rise, according to one geologist at Oregon State University. Well, now that's about 40 inches, so that could be significant, especially when you match that with storm surges, with periods of El Nino, where we have about a ½ foot higher mean sea level. Yeah, it's a tough call. So, but there is no doubt in my mind that sea level is rising. I see it all the time. In the 30 years that I've been back at the coast, I have seen, in one winter storm, 12 feet of real estate go into the ocean. There's sites that were recorded in 1951 by Lloyd Collins when he was doing his principal study of the sites on the Oregon coast. They're no longer there. So just beware where you put your house and throw your sleeping bag. And, yeah, and look at the land, be a part of it. And you know, that's part of our being smart and thinking ahead. Well, here we are, home sweet home. Just wanted to point out that there are cultural resources in your backyard. Now, I have not touched them. I have observed them only. But would sure like to, it seems like it would be a really good idea. I mean, this is such a remarkable community. It has a history that we celebrate, and there's a lot of, I hope you picked that up, there's a lot of information that archaeological excavation analysis can reveal about past environments and cultural items, cultural lifeways, that sort of thing. There's 6 sites that have been formally recorded in this area with the State Historic Preservation Office. And they're primarily on state land. They're primarily in state parks. I'll point out a couple of them here. Just a very tiny, tiny remnant of a site right here. I think this is Mitchell Creek where it comes out. You recognize the familiar landmark? Yeah, that's formally listed. It's disappearing very, very quickly. It's just right now on the isthmus and in a small cove where a stream comes out just to the north of it. And another site, I'm not that tall, but up there in front of the Adobe Motel. And I'll point out as we have some other shots. By the way, these wonderful photographs of the city are compliments. I'm using tonight with the permission of the city. They've been flying tours of the city, and it's going to be a remarkable planning resource for you all to have available. So thank you, Greg, and the city for allowing me to use these tonight. Well, that is where the Adobe sits now. It's a photograph from the Lincoln County Historical Museum. It's actually, interestingly enough, been sewn together. It's actually 2 photographs because if you look really closely, it's the same horses, buggies, and people in both of those. But that's where the Adobe Motel sits, right there, and there's the 804 Trail. Picture taken about probably around 1900, around the turn of the century.
1892.
1892.
It's on the Wikipedia Yahoo's page.
Great, thank you. You know, I'm really good at hundreds of years, thousands of years when it comes down to anything. I'd like to point out the sub-agency house, the agency, Liaison, or the, maybe I should explain that, the LC sub-agency. The coasting reservation was set aside in 1855, thank you very much. 1865, 10 years later, only 10 years later, Congress decided to, well, they don't need the land north of Wallport, so they took out the heart of the reservation. And at that point, the community headquarters, the Siletz headquarters, was in the community of Siletz. But it was with the heart of that taken out from just on the north side of the Alsea River up to Cape Foulweather. They needed another sub-agency. And since it was the Alsea Indians who were living here at this time, they called it the Alsea sub-agency. We have, you've probably noticed on our maps, we have retained a lot of Indian names. Now, it may not have been the names that, how the tribal folks would have pronounced the name, kind of a bastardization of many of them, but we have a lot of those things, you know, when you think about it, Tillamook and Takanich and Siltcoos and, you know, on and on and on. Umpqua, Siuslaw, you know, are names that honor the people who are here, and I really appreciate that. Here's a picture after the same area after the adobe was constructed. And right in front of it, it's a very large shellman. It's sitting on a shellman, but right in front of it was a shellman that was reported to have been as much as 30 feet high and 190 feet long. And it was soon mined. I'll show you next. This is what it looks like today. It had mostly been shoveled out, hauled out on a wagon, and went to fill the muddy roads around here. Now, I don't know whether Shell Road is a reflection of that or not, but it continues on down in front of the restaurant there. You can see just a thin layer of shell. Development's had a huge impact in this community, and because lots are so small, and decisions, oftentimes people don't recognize the worth, the value of these irreplaceable, non-renewable resources, and sometimes they don't even know what they're looking at. I was coming to work a couple of years ago, and I happened to notice that there was pink flagging out in the middle of one of the sites at Cape Perpetua, and so I pulled over and marked out there, and somebody, I know who it was a surveyor for the state, had just dug a 3-foot hole, poured concrete in it, and put a marker in the middle of a house pit in a National Register site. And when I tracked down to find out who had done this, he said, well, you know, and here's a surveyor that goes around and does this all around the Western Oregon. He didn't know what a shellman looked like.